And what about Syria? Like, you're someone who's covered that region. You've been there. You've been totally maligned for writing about it. We've had Aaron Mate on the show, and he's someone who actually talks about basically this chemical weapons. Hi, by the way, thanks for demonetizing this stream. I'm just going to predict that no ads
You're
on this
welcome.
one. Yeah.
We should
But
call it something else, just like not call it Syria. We'll just like
Yeah,
come
no,
up with a code
Schmeria,
name.
Schmeria, yeah, and
Syria.
Schmemical weapons, yeah. But you know, like there's no, there's such little discussion of that here, and anyone who says anything like that is automatically, labeled an Assadist. And I did kind of think that the Saddamist label would have maybe turned people away from that, because I think people who don't like Saddam Hussein still got that, oh right, opposing the war in Iraq doesn't make you pro Saddam Hussein. And also, yeah, Saddam Hussein can be many things, and that doesn't make you. The question is always like, why is the focus where it is with the media?
So I think with Iraq it was easier to oppose that war because the U.S. sent like U.S. military
Right.
to invade and bombed. Whereas with Syria, it's been this war where it was like a proxy war where they had this covert program to spend like $1 billion, biggest covert program in like the history of covert programs, to arm and fund these jihadist groups to try to overthrow the government instead of sending in U.S. soldiers to do it. So, and they dressed it up as this like pretty revolution. They
Right.
just want freedom, right? Like these like jihadis that like are aligned with Saudi Arabia and want to impose Sharia law, just like want to give Damascus freedom from like minorities. But that's how they dressed it up, and that was like a very appealing narrative for people because there was like it fell in line with the whole Arab Spring narrative of like, oh,
Right.
people just want freedom from dictators. It was a very appealing narrative to me at the
Right.
beginning. Like who doesn't want to support people who just like want freedom from a police state? But of course that wasn't what was happening. But I think that's why it was so much more difficult and easier to smear people and so much more difficult to oppose it because people didn't really know what was happening. The media coverage was so one-sided and terrible. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. But as for how Syria is doing now, I mean, yeah, the U.S. is no longer funding and arming jihadist groups to overthrow the government. But these sanctions, I mean, there's Syrians I talk to who like will tell you, war sucks, but war is typically like isolated to certain neighborhoods or like this city or that city. And you can kind of avoid it a little bit depending on where you're located. And you can kind of like live in a little bubble. Whereas with these economic sanctions, like nobody can escape them. It's just destroying the country. And let's remember, like Iraq was before the U.S. invaded Iraq. They spent 10 years destroying that country with sanctions. We know about the infamous, 500,000 children under the age of 5 died of like preventable diseases and starvation because of these sanctions. But it's not just that. The sanctions also destroyed education. Iraq had one of the highest literacy rates in the region in the 1980s. By the end of the 1990s, they had like the lowest literacy rate. It destroys the government's ability to subsidize anything, right? So people go hungry, people don't have jobs, like the living standards go down dramatically. Then you have the flight of like the professional class, doctors, lawyers, teachers. These people all leave, the people you need for like a healthy functioning society. Especially doctors. That's what's happening in Syria. That's what's happened. The war already started that. People were leaving, but now they're leaving even more because there's literally no future. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to send your kid to school to do what? There's no jobs. And if they do get a job, the salary is going to be worthless because the currency is constantly devaluing. There's just no future. So like so many people I know in Syria have actually left. They all live in Dubai now, or in Lebanon, or in Germany, or they go to Canada or the U.S. Like they just try to get out. That's what everyone in Lebanon's doing now too. They're all leaving the professional class. You have this flight of people, professors and doctors. And so that's really damaging to a society. It changes a society like really dramatically in a very, very negative way. And it softens them up for like regime change later. And that's kind of what's happening in Syria. So, I hate to say it, but like if this continues, I don't know what's going to be left of Syria in another 5 or 6 years or 10 years. Like, think about the people who, there's like an educated class of Syrians who went to higher education, and now they're maybe my age, they're in their 30s, right? But what about the Syrians who are 13 right now, like who are suffering educationally and nutritionally? Like, what happens in 10 years to them? What are their lives going to be like? Like, what do they have going for them? Not much, and it's because of US sanctions. So, and it's sad because, like, despite what the damage that sanctions have done in the past, like, there is no movement or momentum in the US whatsoever from any quarter of any move, like anybody ideologically, to end these sanctions. There's been a couple of, like, attempts or maybe bills or maybe resolutions by the sort of progressive members of Congress saying, like, let's reduce sanctions, but nothing else. And it really is sad because these sanctions, like, the level of suffering and devastation they do to a culture and a society is irreparable.